asking that he would provide someone. So if you would just continue to pray for that, I would appreciate it. My name is Buddy. I'm on staff here. If you are new and we haven't met, hello. If you are at least 1 week with us, yes, my real name is Matthew. Scott let that one out of the bag, and so just if you ever see him, just go ahead and say hi to our previous elder and church attendee. He's probably going to be real lonely. And no, he did an awesome job. And so we're just going to build off of his message. Last week, Scott, one of our elders, covered. We were on vacation, my family and I, and he did a wonderful job wrapping up Matthew chapter 21. And so we're going to just cover the next step. Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14 is where we will find ourselves. We're doing a lot of praying, but I'm going to do it one more time at least. So if you'd bow your heads with me. God, thank you so much for you. Thank you that you have created us with a drive and a need and an appetite that only you can satisfy. God, as we gather together here, we recognize we are in your presence. Lord, as we will be exposed to the truth of your word, I pray that you would have your will and your way in us and through us. God, I recognize that at best I bring a voice and an imagination, but what is required is your spirit to make your text come alive. And not only that, Lord, but your spirit to help your people to receive it and to translate it and to apply it. And so we're counting on you, Lord. We pray that you would have your way in this service. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, Matthew chapter 22, verse 1. Hey, before I get into it, I need to kind of talk about my kid for a while. He's amazing. I forgot to pass this by him. I normally, I have this policy where I generally ask permission before I talk, but I broke it, so I'm pre-apologizing, Abe. Our oldest, he's a good-looking kid. He's handsome, he's just yoked, and he loves looking good. The kid can dress up like nobody's business. They referring to my boys, they just almost always look better than I do. And I've never actually cared about that, but they oftentimes just look really, really sharp. And one of the neat things about Abe is he likes presenting himself well, and I think that's great. Another neat thing about Abe is he's very opinionated, and he's really gifted at sharing those opinions, even unsolicited, which is fun for my wife and I. Abe will check us out before we go to a church function or anything, and he doesn't have to say anything. You can just read his face, what he's really thinking about our outfits. Even though he doesn't have to say anything, he does, and he's like, are you really going to wear that? Yeah? It's fine. There's no spots bigger than a quarter. No one 2 feet away or farther can smell me. We're good to go, right? Everything's buttoned, everything's zipped. I'm okay. I can walk out of this house and feel all right about myself. Whereas Abe just has a much, much higher level of presentability. He understands what it means to look good. I don't and never will and don't care to. So if that's one of your prayer requests, give it up. Pray for something more important. I'll just continue to not care about how I look, and you can figure out other things to pray about. Today we're going to be talking about a parable, and it seems to be about a wedding, but it ends with being about what we wear, what we're clothed with, how we present ourselves. And in my study this week, and obviously through prayer, really feel like, at least for me, at least for us this week, that feels like the crux of the teaching. And so let's just dive in. Again, Jesus spoke to them in parables. And so this is Jesus last week on earth, pre-crucifixion, resurrection. He is in Jerusalem. It is a Passover feast celebration. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jews coming together in Jerusalem to observe this feast and this act of worship. Jesus now has been speaking to the crowds. He's obviously speaking with his disciples in tow. And not only that, but just as Scott covered last week, the religious leaders, specifically the priests and the Pharisees, are just like gnats. They're just bothering him. They're just following him and trying to debate with him and trip him up and point out anything that they view is an error. And so Jesus has just really, really strongly rebuked them. And right upon the heels of that, if that didn't leave any doubt, Jesus tells another parable about their wickedness, about their rejection of him and ultimately of God. And so he just dives in. He said, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son." I'm nerdy. I love digging through the word. I love figuring out what was the original language. You can click on every word if you have the right software, and there's tons of neat stuff online to do this that's free. And what I was really interested to find in this first verse is that when Jesus told this parable, he didn't actually say that there was a king. And why I think that is important is because Jesus is baiting these guys. He begins by telling them a story, and he said, in actual literal translation, he said, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who gave a wedding feast for his son. And so we have no context. We don't know who the man is, were we to read this accurately word for word. Further on, Jesus flat out says it's a king, so the translators just said, well, we know he's a king, so we'll just say he's a king from the get-go. But the actual word is anthropos, where we get like the idea of anthropomorphic or something that's human. It can be translated in this original Greek, men, man, mankind. It's just a general gender-neutral term that just means humans. There's this guy who has a son who throws a wedding feast. Literally 500 plus times it's used as man, men, or mankind, or humankind, and literally only this one time is it used as king. And so 500 to 1, it's just mankind. Why I think that is important is not because I'm super nerdy or I want to show you how smart I am, but I think it's interesting that Jesus is trying with this base level and beginning to develop his character as any good storyteller would. He doesn't just throw the kind of the linchpin out right at the beginning, but he builds upon this. Imagine with me, if you will, there's a random guy, just a guy. Imagine whoever you want. And he has a son, and they're throwing a wedding feast. For the ancient Jews, culturally, it's hard for us to really understand what that meant. How I understand the way that weddings took place way back when was almost exactly opposite of everything that we think is right and everything that we do today. Most of the time, most of the marriages, they were arranged by the parents. It would be very, very normal for the bride and the groom to not have a loving relationship at the time that their marriage was arranged. Oftentimes, they wouldn't have even known each other or even met each other at all until this agreement, this covenant was made, not with the persons involved, but with their parents who legally represented them. And so the parents would come together, they would write this contract, and there might have been a dowry or a bride price, who knows exactly what is involved, but they would sign this, the marriage would be legal at that point. But the couple wouldn't move in together. There was no wedding ceremony. The wedding wasn't consummated. That would wait for a time. And this is exactly kind of where we see Mary and Joseph in the story of Jesus. That's why it's real awkward that they were engaged to one another, but it didn't seem like they knew one another well. They were in this particular betrothal period that we find the story picking up on. And so during this time, they remained faithful to one another. The man in particular had a good job, which meant you need to go and prepare your life for your new bride. Oftentimes, that would literally mean buying or building a home and creating a home for your new family, upon which, when that was ready, the husband or the groom would go and he would collect his wife, and then at that point, when he was finally ready to provide for her, then the marriage celebration would actually be celebrated. These celebrations were huge. They were probably the single most important social event of someone's lifetime, and the celebration could last as long as 7 days. Guys, I know I've just lost you here. You think that I just communicated the literal definition of hell for you, but it's not really what we're talking about here. We're not talking about like a stuffy ceremony where you're just in a church and you're watching something go on stage and your tie is too tight. I wouldn't actually know what that feels like, but my kids do. And rather, these feasts were exactly that. They were a celebration. They were a party. They were feasts. We can read about biblically over and over again. Lots of food, lots of wine, lots of mirth, lots of happiness. This is a huge celebration. And so when Jesus begins saying, there's this random guy, he's got a kid, it's time for his kid's wedding feast, this was going on in the background of everyone's mind. They understood this is important. This is the biggest event of these people's lives. This is a time of celebration. Hard work has gone into this. This has been a long time coming as this betrothal period comes to an end and the wedding is finally celebrated. The marriage is actually consummated. The life really, truly begins here and now. And so when Jesus communicates this, these people would have also understood that RSVPs have already been sent out. All of these people, they've already received their invitation. The people who had relationship with or who worked in close proximity to those who are getting married or their parents, they would know that they're invited. They have been communicated with already. They're literally just waiting for a date and a time to go and eat a lot and drink a lot and celebrate a lot and have a very good time celebrating this new wedding. And so Jesus said that's all occurred. And so this man sends his servants to call on those who were invited to the wedding feast. If we didn't know this guy were a king, we would begin to understand he's a person of some means. He is capable of, number one, just celebrating a wedding feast. He has his own servants, and he's called his servants to go and to implore people, those who are invited, to come to the wedding feast. Who wouldn't go to a week-long party, free food, free drink for a week? It's a party. Like, what's unappealing about that? It's hard to know, but it's interesting because Jesus' story takes a weird turn here, and he says, but they wouldn't come. None of those who were invited came to the wedding. From just like a purely superficial standpoint, that just doesn't make any sense. Who turns down a free party? Who turns down a free meal and free drink and a good time with your friends and your family? That just is illogical. I can't explain or understand that. Furthermore, they would know by doing this, they are crossing a very clear line that is offensive. They're abstaining from celebrating the most important thing for these people. If they're invited, you can clearly understand that there's relationship, there's proximity here, they're somehow connected through life, and they are choosing, for no particular reason apparently, to offend these people, to abstain from going. Their presence or the lack thereof will be noticed. And so Jesus makes this weird statement. There's this feast, and it's going to be awesome, and they're invited, and then they're sent to be collected to come to the celebration, and you know what? For some weird reason, none of them come. Weird. And so he continues on. So again, this man sent even other servants. We begin to build upon this. This guy actually might be a man of great wealth and great means if he can celebrate this thing, and he has servants upon servants that do his bidding, and he sends this second group of servants, and he says, tell those who are invited, look, I prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fat calves, they've all been slaughtered, and everything's ready. Come to the wedding feast. Like, how much more do you need from this man, this father? He's excited. We read goodwill in here. Like, he really, truly wants to celebrate the good fortune of his son. He wants to make a big deal out of this wedding. He wants to throw just a wildly successful wedding feast, and yet no one wants to come. And so he tries talking him into this, like, hey, have I told you what's on the menu? Like, we're talking like tri-tip here and foie gras, anyone? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I said that wrong. And like 4 of you even know what that means. Never mind. And he's like trying to convince him, like, even if you don't like me, even if you don't care about my son's wedding, like, did you read the menu? Free of charge. Do you understand what I'm offering you guys? Like, he's really just trying to appeal even to like a base, self-centered approach to this feast. He's not saying, hey, if you don't attend, you've broken relationship. Do you understand how offensive it is if you decline my invitation? He's not going that route. He's just merely saying, it's going to be really fun, guys. Come on, it's going to be fun. Come celebrate with me. And yet, even with everything ready, even with a clear invitation, come to the wedding feast. Verse 5 says they paid no attention. That word means, that can be translated as they cared not. They had no concerns. And they went off, one to his farm and another to his business. And so these people, they're unmoved. They're unconcerned. They couldn't care less about this wedding feast. They're quite fine with making a very offensive social etiquette taboo thing going on here. They're okay with that. They go off to their farm, to their business. They've got stuff to do. There are priorities that are much higher in their life than this particular wedding feast is. And then things just get so much weirder. Then the rest of them seized these servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. Does anything in your life ever feel like it escalates super quickly? Okay, you've got nothing on this, right? Like, someone came and they invited us to a wedding, and I just ignored them and went back to work, but my friends killed the dudes who invited us to a wedding. Like, okay, let's hope that this is a parable. Let's hope this is a made-up story, because this is getting weirder and weirder and less logical. Why? Why would you turn this down? Much more, why would you be so offended that you were offered a blessing that you would do harm to and even kill those who were the messengers of that good news? That doesn't make any sense. Verse 7 finally comes along, and finally Jesus relates to us who this nameless character actually is. So this dad, this nameless guy who apparently is kind of wealthy, he's the monarch. He's the autocrat. He has full and complete authority over these people. He's not just their relative. He's not a close friend that they've chosen to offend. He is their one and only king. These people are his subjects. They understand what they're doing when they turn him down, when they ignore him, when they put off his messengers. They clearly get what they're doing is offensive. It is wrong. It is rebellion. It is wickedness. So much so that they're just willing to begin killing every single messenger that comes along. Obviously, we're beginning to understand there's a lot more going on here than a made-up wedding feast. Jesus is communicating about his Father. Jesus here is calling out Israel. This is exactly what the people of God have done to their monarch. They have used him. They have abused him. They have ignored him. They have mistreated his messengers. They have plugged their ears. They have closed their eyes. They have hardened their hearts towards the one who is offering them the blessing of all blessings. And they have no reason for it. There's no justification for this. It's not as if they have anything better going on. It's not as if God were one of many good options. He's quite literally all that they have. And yet over and over and over again, his people continue to choose selfishness and sin and self-destruction and open and evil rebellion against their king. The people who are beginning to understand this are beginning to put two and two together. Ooh, so we're talking about a king, we're talking about people rejecting him and his messengers. They know that Jesus is talking about them. It is quite clear that Jesus is calling these people out, that God has had enough, that there's only so far that you can push God until the consequences start coming back upon yourself. And so Jesus continues. So the king, quite justifiably, was furious. He was angry. This word is a settled opposition. It's not as if the king, obviously God, lost control of his emotions. This is a purposeful attempt to communicate anger, this long burn, if you will, instead of a flash in the pan. So the king was furious. He sent his troops out, and he actually destroyed all of the murderers who mistreated and killed his messengers. Furthermore, he even burned their city to the ground. He obliterated them. That word "burn to the ground" is really interesting because I think Jesus is doing some wordplay there, which we'll connect with later on. But the actual word for filling a city with fire, to burn a city down in the original language means it was swollen, it was pregnant, it was filled with fire. Like to the maximum degree, these people received the punishment that they worked for so long and for so hard. That was a really, really hard sentence to communicate. I don't know why. I'm going to just keep moving on. So it said that the king in verse 8 said to his servants, "The wedding feast is still ready, but those who were invited were not worthy." It's so interesting that God, obviously the king here, is communicating an invitation, a liberal, broad invitation to anyone who will respond. Do you want to come? Will you receive my blessings? Do you want relationship with me? Can I bless you and your family for thousands of generations? And over again, God is turned down by people throughout the history of the world. And so he responds. If they do not choose God, then obviously they don't get God. It's not as if these people couldn't come to the wedding. It's that these people wouldn't come to the wedding. And so God still has this wedding. This king still wants to celebrate the betrothal of his son. There is still something wonderful going on, and the king refuses to stop the celebration. So he says, "No, we've got another plan. Here we go. Go therefore to the main roads, invite into the wedding feast literally anyone you find. Anyone you find. I don't care how close they are, if they're near or far to me. I don't care if they're just on the borderline of my empire. Invite them. Anyone and everyone is welcome. It doesn't matter if they're suitable. It doesn't matter if they're even wanting for or looking for an invitation. Let them know that they are invited. This will be wonderful." Who wants to go to a wedding like that, where you don't know the bride and the groom or anyone else there and they don't know you? No, me neither. Okay, yeah, that sounds horrible. So he does that exactly. Go find people we don't know who aren't even looking for a wedding feast and invite them to my house. That would be great. And so the servants went out, and they went to the roads, and they gathered all whom they found. And only Jesus can get away with this. If you heard a preacher say this, you would think that he's liberal, that he's sliding with his doctrine, and he's getting a little bit too full of grace and mercy and wants to extend it to everyone. But Jesus Christ says, "So they found both the good and the bad, and all of them came to the wedding feast, so that the wedding hall was filled with guests." Clearly, Jesus is talking about, again, more than a wedding feast. Him communicating now is exactly what happened to him after he was killed and resurrected, that the gospel went out to all nations. That's us. That we are part of these people who weren't looking for an invitation, who didn't even have a relationship with those who were getting married, but we have the blessing of being invited into something that previously we're utterly detached from. And so Jesus is communicating his plan for this idea of the gospel reaching all nations, of especially being preached to and accepted by people who totally do not deserve it. I love that. This word bad isn't actually intrinsically evil. There is a word for that, and Jesus doesn't use it. But this particular word, it's paneros. It has this root word of agony. It is literally the word used for the birth pains of childbearing. Thank God I don't know anything about that. But it sounds real bad. And so Jesus is communicating, these people who are bad, it's not that they're intrinsically evil and enemies, but rather they live with the pain of a sin-filled life. They recognize the burden, the brokenness that they carry. And even for those folks, this invitation is wide open. For as many who will listen and respond, the wedding feast is open and available to them, to us, to you. And so Jesus said, so that the wedding hall will be filled with guests. And that word filled, again, means pregnant or swollen or full. And so he has these two ideas of fullness. There's this one particular fullness, and it's full of punishment. It's full of condemnation. And that's not mean, it's not evil, it's actually just. And it's actually well-deserved. And God is right in doing that. And that we do not have moral superiority over God so that we can sit above him and say, that's not okay, that's not fair, that's not right, that's not nice. God gets to set those as king, as monarch. And so he says, there will be this place where the fullness of punishment exists. And anyone who refuses me over and over and over again, that's their destination. That's where they're going to end up. But to those who respond, even if they know that they don't deserve it, but they respond nevertheless, there is this place of the fullness of celebration and of life and of blessing and of relationship with the King. And so Jesus, in essence, is offering these people two roads, two options. Will you choose life, or are you going to choose death? There's fullness. There is absolute fullness in your future. Which fullness do you want to participate in? And so Jesus closes the little story by saying, by imploring, by encouraging. The question that he leaves unasked is, where are you going to end up? And all of it obviously is based upon your response to the invitation, the good news of Jesus. The story takes another turn. Chapter 2, which starts in verse 11, chapter 2, a little parable. But when the king came to look at his guests, and so imagine that we're part of this wedding ceremony now. We are apparently in the king's residence, in his celebration hall. There's food, drink, party galore, entertainment, you name it, it's happening here. And the king comes in to inspect his guests. He's looking around to see if everyone who is here belongs here. And it said that he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. I don't think that the dude's naked. Okay, I don't think that's what he's communicating. I know that's where your minds went to. But what's actually going on, you guys are like, our pastor's so weird. It's true. And I don't care what I look like. So there's that. This guy has no wedding garment. Again, culturally for us, it's weird. It doesn't make sense. But what we can obviously understand is this guy was not dressed appropriately. At bare minimum, we understand that this guy chose not to dress appropriately. He sticks out. He doesn't fit in. It's a choice of his to show up and to pretend as if he's part of this celebration, this ceremony, and yet he has willfully chosen to not fit in. Another thing that might be happening here, it seems like a pretty common occurrence back then, you can read about it in ancient texts, is that when someone rich, like a king, threw a wedding, everyone that they invited also got a uniform, if you will, to wear to the party. And so if a king were to invite you to his son's wedding, not only would you get an invitation, but you would get a set of clothes that you got to wear there. It's like a uniform, like a sports uniform, or a wedding costume. How fun is that? Yep, it's fun, right? Ladies, I know that bridesmaids, you always love the dresses that you have to wear. I have learned enough about weddings to know that that is literally always your most favorite dress. I know that. Absolutely know that. And so imagine that. You have been invited. You have not only been invited, but at very least, you understand what you need to wear. The expectations are clear. And probably you have even been provided that which you need to wear, so that everything is covered by the king. Whatever is going on, we understand that this man sticks out. He has willfully chosen not to fit in. And by doing so, he is behaving like a hypocrite. He is there, so it seems as if he is a supporter of this wedding celebration. It seems as if he is a friend of those getting married because he's showed up. It seems as though he's filled with joy because this is a feast. This is a party. But at the very same time, simultaneously, he's gone well out of his way to let everyone know he doesn't really fit in. He hasn't fully bought into the program. He's going to be his own unique self and not do the whole program that everybody else is doing. And so the king responds poorly, obviously. And the king said to him, "Friend." This word friend occurs 3 times in Scripture. They're all 3 in Matthew. And literally every single one of them is sarcasm. This word literally does not mean friend. It means a traitor. It means someone who fakes it, who pretends to be a friend, but only does so for selfish gain, for selfish motivation. And so this king calls this person this word that they would know would mean you hypocrite, you fool, you faker. How did you get in here without a wedding garment? And the man, it says, was speechless. He was without defense. There was nothing he could say to justify his actions. He knew that he was guilty. There was no getting around it, and so he was speechless. And then Jesus kind of breaks from the whole parable and clearly starts talking about something a lot deeper than a wedding feast. The king said to his attendants, "Bind him, hand and foot, and cast him into outer darkness. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And again throughout this parable, we recognize, again, 2 options. Celebrate, respond to this feast, and be a part of it. Like if you're going to respond really fully, completely, comprehensively, do what the king wants you to do. And you will find celebration and life and a community to celebrate with. Or you can show up and you can do things on your own terms, and you don't have to lose your identity or your autonomy. But I tell you what, you're going to be found out. It will be obvious that you're not a true friend of the king, and that will cause you separation and a lot of agony as Jesus communicates. And Jesus ends this parable, as we'll end in verse 14. He says something weird. He says, "For many are called, but few are chosen." That doesn't really make any sense. It would make sense if he said, "Many are called, but few respond." That actually is congruent and makes sense. But what Jesus said is many are called. The invitation, it is liberal. The doors are wide open. Anyone, literally anyone who wants to come to this wedding feast, the invitation is extended to them. But interestingly enough, the inverse of that is not just that few of them respond, but few of them are chosen, referring to God choosing us. And so the question for us is this invitation, this gospel, this good news, the whole shtick of Christianity. Do we respond to it wholeheartedly or not? We have received the invitation. If you're here, I'm assuming you know a little bit about Christianity, that this is a life that we are called to. It's not a life that makes you happy and healthy and wealthy. It's not attending here equals success in the rest of the world. To come here means to become like Jesus. And Jesus became like a servant, and he suffered and he died so that others may live. That is the gospel. That is the invitation that is extended to us. How you respond is vitally important for your eternal destination. Fakers will be found out immediately. You can't half-heart this. You can't just do a bare minimum for God. There's no bare minimum requirements here. It's kind of an all or nothing thing. It was for Jesus. Why do you think you would get away with something less than that? And so Jesus communicates that. Everyone's called. But then once we respond to that, there is this mystery that happens when God allows us to become part of the celebration. That when we respond, we enter into this mysterious union where our response and our willingness to be one of God's children is met with God's choosing of us. That it is he who does the work, so that we can't boast. We can't say, well, I chose to be a Christian because I'm just morally superior. Or I'm more evolved spiritually, so it just makes more sense to me. Or I've got a greater intellect, so the beauty of the gospel, I get it. And people who are uneducated, they can't get it. And so I'm better than they are. That's not at all what is being communicated. What is communicated is the invitation is universal. No one is excluded from heaven except those who choose not to join in. But what is amazing is that God is the one who does the inviting, who throws the party, who hosts it, who allows us the uniform that we need to be in the place where we want to be. This idea of uniform is fascinating to me. It's actually throughout Scripture. I was surprised to read that. Even in Isaiah, like 670 years before Jesus here, Isaiah chapter 61:10 says, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall exult in my God. Why? For he has clothed me with garments of salvation, and he has covered me in robes of righteousness. I love this picture of wearing robes of righteousness. That our salvation, more than just a personal relationship with Jesus, how it is often communicated, our salvation, viewed by the prophet Isaiah, is like a robe. It's like a cloak. It's like the uniform of heaven, if you will. So that everyone who sees us sees to whom we belong, what our values are, who we are, what we are living for. That it should be as obvious as looking at my well-dressed son. Man, that kid's got class and style. And our salvation should be that evident to the world around us. It says so much about who we are, about what we are. In Zechariah chapter 3, there is this vision of the prophet where he is standing before the Lord and he realizes he is wearing filthy rags. He's embarrassed. He's showed up and he's not wearing what is correct to wear in the presence of the king. And God himself removes those through his messengers, the angels, and he clothes this man in robes of white. If robes of white triggers any memories of you, well, it's mentioned several times in Revelation where the martyrs, God's people, are forever state in heaven and praise and worship. Yeah, we're clothed in robes of white too. That there's this congruent idea throughout Scripture that Jesus here in this parable is building upon is, are you clothed in this salvation? Do you recognize that only God can provide this for you? In Isaiah, a few chapters later, in Isaiah chapter 64, God communicates to his prophet something that frankly is pretty unacceptable to say from stage. God is communicating to his people, and he says to them, in essence, to paraphrase, all of your acts of righteousness, all of this religious stuff you do to try to look better, to try to impress people, God says, I view those as dirty feminine hygiene cloths. Ew. So this is what we are unless we are clothed in the robes of righteousness of God. Only God has what we need, the garments to wrap us in, to clothe us right, to allow us to fit in his kingdom. And Jesus here is communicating this. If you guys have Bibles, can you turn to Colossians chapter 3? We're going to close with verses 12 through 17. Paul here, a few decades later, is writing to a church in Colossae. People who live in Colossae are called Colossians, which is where we get this name. And in chapter 3, it seems as if Paul is reflecting upon this parable. His language is almost identical to the language that Jesus uses. And he says, put on, therefore, as God's chosen ones. And so Paul here immediately uses two of the words that Jesus ends his parable with. Jesus says, many are called, but few are chosen. Eklektos is that chosen word in Greek. And that's exactly how Paul begins this passage in Colossians. What you need to wear, what your uniform is as God's eklektos, as God's chosen ones, are this: holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, that we ought to bear with one another, and if you have complaint against one another, don't grudge them, don't gossip about them, but rather forgive one another, because the Lord Jesus Christ has forgiven you, and so also you must forgive one another. Paul is elaborating on that. If it sounds real neat to be clothed in robes of righteousness, that's great. But what in the world does that mean? I mean, it sounds great in my imagination. We're all like walking around in glowing robes, but how do you live that out? What does that mean for me tomorrow at work or at school? And I believe Paul here in Colossians 3 is fleshing that out for us. This is what you look like. This is how you behave if you have been clothed with God's robes of righteousness that are only available through salvation in Jesus. That God will view you as holy and beloved. He will recognize your heart not as a dead heart of stone, but as a compassionate heart. You will have kindness and humility and meekness. You will be clothed in patience, and you will bear with one another. You will love one another. You will forgive one another. This is what it looks like to be part of the wedding feast of the King. The challenging thing for me is to figure out how many of us are actually clothed in the robes of God's righteousness. In the way we communicate here at Anthem is most religion is man's attempt to find out how to make our own robes of righteousness, to try to be better, to make ourselves better, to act better. And as God clearly explicitly communicated in disgusting terms, that's gross. Don't do that. You don't want that. You don't want to wear that stuff. But he has provided us with another opportunity. And in verse 14, Paul continues for us, and he says, above all of these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. I want to challenge you. Paul kind of closes with this idea of love. Like, that's the deciding factor. If you ever look on the back of your clothes and there's a tag and it says what it's made out of, I imagine our robes of righteousness having a tag. It just says 100% love. How dorky is that? It was pretty dorky. And I believe Paul is trying to communicate this. Like, listen, if you are one who has responded, if you recognize the beauty of the gospel, if you can celebrate how little you deserve this, but how good it really is once you do respond, if any of that is you, your life will be changed. You can't help it. You don't choose it. This is part and parcel of your salvation. You are reclothed. You are retooled. You are remade. You are a new creation. And this is exactly what is expected of you. Oftentimes, in some of my darker times, I wonder, how many of us, when we gather here, how many of you who call Anthem your church are actually clothed in robes of righteousness? How many of you really are just deceiving yourselves and really no one else? You think you're doing well, and you're working hard for God, and you're really letting the world have it, and you're fighting for what is right. You're trying to put on a good show. Maybe you sincerely want to honor God. All of those things intrinsically might be okay. But if you haven't surrendered and sacrificed to this God, if you haven't laid your life down so that Christ's life could be made alive within you, my caution for you, my warning, my plea is stop playing those games. Would you respond to Jesus? Would you recognize, again, that there is fullness available to every one of us? And we get to choose whether it is the fullness of destruction or the fullness of life as found in Jesus. And my hope is when we are clothed in love, legitimately alive in and in love with this Jesus, that we will be seen for what we are. Our garments will be obvious. Our ensemble will match, and we will look good, and it will make the world be drawn to the difference that they see in us. And again, all too often I wonder, is there any difference at all that is seen in people who claim to be God's? Is there any difference? And if there isn't, my challenge to you is I think you've got some really, really hard work to do with Jesus. Would you guys stand with me?